Welcome to Spoiled Vision Movie Recaps. In this installment, we delve into the 2022 crime series, Blackbird. Spoiler alert, proceed with caution. The series kicks off with Jimmy Keene, portrayed by Taron Egerton. In his high school days, Jimmy was a football player, but his life takes a dramatic turn when he gets involved with narcotics. One day, he confronts his supplier, Rog, accusing him of shortchanging him on the drugs. Rog values trust above all else and denies any wrongdoing. When Jimmy confronts Rog, he discovers his childhood friend, Danny, held captive for stealing Rog's drugs. Despite Danny's troublesome nature, Jimmy feels pity for him and offers 3 kilos of his drugs to Rog in exchange for Danny's release. Later that night, Jimmy visits an upscale restaurant and strikes up a connection with a lovely waitress. What transpires afterward is left to your imagination. The next morning, DEA agents led by FBI agent Lauren McCauley storm Jimmy's house. Not only do they find the sleeping waitress, but they also uncover incriminating evidence, including illegal drugs, stacks of cash, and various firearms without permits. These discoveries could lead to severe penalties for Jimmy. Jimmy's father, a former police chief, visits him in prison and had previously spoken with the prosecutor Beaumont. Beaumont aims to prove that Jimmy is connected to a criminal syndicate, even though Jimmy denies any such affiliation. If Jimmy pleads guilty, he faces a 5-year prison sentence, but due to the firearms, it could be extended to 10 years. During the trial, Jimmy confesses to his involvement in narcotics and admits to possessing illegal firearms. Watching from the back, Lauren observes as the judge hands down a 10-year sentence, which is 5 years longer than his father's initial prediction of 120 months. Jimmy is furious and vents his anger towards Beaumont. 7 months later, Jimmy receives a visit from FBI agent Lauren and prosecutor Beaumont. Prison records show that Jimmy has developed positive relationships with fellow inmates, including some of the gang members who wield influence behind bars. Jimmy also has a side gig, renting explicit magazines to his fellow inmates. His calm demeanor and charismatic personality make it easy for him to befriend even hardened criminals. Lauren wants to assign Jimmy a special mission, to transfer him to a maximum security prison. His task? To obtain information about the whereabouts of 14 victims' bodies, all murdered by a deranged psychopath. The police have only found one body so far, and Jimmy must form an alliance with his sinister character to uncover the burial sites. Despite tempting offers of freedom or a full pardon for his sentence, Jimmy initially declines. However, when Jimmy learns that the perpetrator has filed an appeal, putting potential future victims at risk, he has a change of heart. He reluctantly accepts Agent Lauren's offer, much to his father's apprehension. Springfield, a special prison for the most dangerous and ruthless criminals, awaits him. Most inmates there have life sentences and have resigned themselves to their fates. Jimmy's father fears the plan might backfire, resulting in additional, longer sentences. Shifting back to the investigation into the suspected serial killer, we flash back 4 years earlier. Detective Brian receives information from the Marion County Chief Detective about the discovery of Jessica Roach's body. A mechanic reported seeing a suspicious man driving a gray Dodge, providing a crucial lead. 11 months later, Brian identifies a man named Larry, whose car matches the mechanic's description. Larry has also been implicated in asthma-related cases. Returning to Jimmy's situation, he eventually accepts the mission, and his father promises to find a way to expedite his release. Meanwhile, in the investigation, Brian seeks assistance from Detective Chris, who grew up with Larry in their hometown. It's revealed that Larry had a penchant for participating in Civil War reenactments, despite his current life behind bars. Jimmy, growing increasingly weary of his daily routine, contemplates accepting the offer after reviewing the relevant documents. However, Detective Brian's inquiries regarding permits from Civil War reenactment participants yield no results. He does discover a permit for a Revolutionary War reenactment, and to his surprise, the date coincides with the discovery of the victim's body. In the midst of these events, Jimmy's stepmother visits him and delivers the grim news that his father has suffered a stroke, rendering him weak and frail. His father's deteriorating health, exacerbated by concern for Jimmy's well-being in prison, acts as the catalyst for the stroke. Brian, recognizing the limited time left for Jimmy's father, reaches out to Chris once more. Chris, familiar with Larry's background, reveals that Larry is not a dangerous man. He grew up in a cemetery as his parents were gravediggers, and his peculiar demeanor stemmed from an intellectual disability. Larry was a frequent target of childhood bullying. Brian also uncovers that Larry previously confessed to the murder of a girl in Marion City, though the police didn't believe him, as they had already apprehended the real perpetrator. Jimmy reunites with Lauren to accept her offer, but her decision isn't immediate. Lauren has other applicants and extends the same proposal to them. She informs her superior and instructs Jimmy to thoroughly study the case files to prepare for the upcoming interview. At the local police station, Brian encounters Chris and learns that Larry is being questioned by another detective from Marion County regarding the Tricia Rattler murder case. When they finally meet Larry, the suspected serial killer's appearance doesn't match their expectations, casting doubt on his culpability. Brian discreetly investigates Jessica's murder, questioning Larry about his involvement in the Revolutionary War reenactment the previous summer. Larry exhibits unusual behavior, particularly avoiding contact with Brian's hand. Upon confessing that he owned a Dodge van, the same type of vehicle spotted at the crime scene, Larry's bizarre revelations leave Brian intrigued. Larry dreams of killing women, a detail that raises concerns among the detectives. The narrative transitions to the second episode, where a curly-haired girl's mysterious disappearance near a car raises questions about her potential connection to Tricia Rattler, one of the victims in Marion. Lauren conducts an interview with Jimmy, inquiring about his preferences in women, both liked and disliked. Unbeknownst to Jimmy, Lauren has ulterior motives, as the person he'll later need to befriend is a serial killer responsible for the deaths of multiple women. When Lauren inquires about what Larry doesn't like about women, Jimmy responds that he doesn't know, which infuriates Lauren, who questions why he didn't study the case files properly. During the interrogation, Larry confesses that he frequently dreams of killing women, describing the sensation of his soul separating from his body. It's also revealed that Larry has a non-identical twin brother named Gary. Brian then shows Larry a photo of Jessica, at which point Larry begins to act strangely, refusing to look at the picture and expressing a strong desire to leave. These behaviors, combined with Larry's dreams, raise suspicions about his involvement in Jessica's murder. However, the state detectives are reluctant to let Brian take over the case. Brian seeks assistance from FBI agent Lauren, enlisting the help of Prosecutor Beaumont in their pursuit of this case. In another meeting with Lauren, Jimmy exudes confidence that the FBI will choose him for the mission. Lauren reveals that a park ranger and a boxing champion will be his competitors for this mission. However, Jimmy's failure to provide an honest answer about the cause of his parents' divorce leaves Lauren frustrated. His father's alcoholism and bribery during his tenure as a police chief, coupled with his mother's ever-changing partners, left Jimmy feeling abandoned and led him into narcotics from a young age, fostering a sense of loneliness. Lauren's questions serve a purpose, as Jimmy must position himself mentally when dealing with Larry. Jimmy can relate to the feeling of being misunderstood, which will be crucial during his interactions with the serial killer. Larry's interrogation continues, this time with the accompaniment of FBI agent Mark in another room, while Agent Lauren monitors the proceedings. Before answering any questions, Larry is required to sign a statement letter. However, he refuses to sign a second letter authorizing a polygraph test or lie detector, fearing that he won't pass it. Upon returning to the room, Larry expresses discomfort and insists on having Mark present. He admits to feeling lonely due to his lack of a girlfriend and low self-esteem, attributing his nightmares to the suppression of his urges. Mark shows Larry a photo of Jessica, and this time, Larry appears calmer. He reveals that he first encountered her while she was cycling, and subsequently, she entered his car. Larry claims not to have had time to bury her, and the location he mentions in Indiana is close to where the police discovered her body. Shockingly, Larry admits to killing several other women, including a woman in Marion named Tricia Rattler. Larry's shocking confession was sufficient to charge him in court. Mark quickly transcribed Larry's initial confession, which detailed how he saw Tricia, pushed her into his car, strangled her to death, and raped her before changing his mind. When they showed this confession letter to Larry, he initially denied these actions, but he eventually agreed to sign it. The FBI acted swiftly, conducting a search of Larry's house for evidence. They discovered 2 vans, one filled with items and the other appearing empty, but meticulously cleaned. It was later revealed that Larry worked as a janitor, and his boss attested to his competence. Jimmy inquired about Larry's twin brother, Gary, and Lauren explained the concept of twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome in the womb, where one twin absorbs more nutrients, resulting in varying abilities. Gary is portrayed as the intelligent, athletic one who staunchly defends his brother, asserting that they don't kill people they don't know. Lauren instructs Jimmy to act like Gary during their next encounter. Surprisingly, Lauren promptly takes Jimmy on a private jet to commence the mission, as he has been selected. The agents attending to him are considerate, removing his handcuffs and providing casual clothing. In his new prison, only the warden and chief psychiatrists are privy to the plan, as Jimmy will pretend to be an arms dealer in a prison known for housing first-class criminals. Lauren pledges to visit him in prison, masquerading as his girlfriend. Jimmy boldly flirts with the FBI agent, even suggesting they practice their roles as a couple on the plane. Brian officially transfers Larry from the state police to his own police station. On their way, Brian continues his investigation into this enigmatic psychopath. Strangely, Larry now behaves like an intelligent person who was coerced into making a false confession. As Jimmy approaches the prison gates, he experiences fear and doubt about the mission, contemplating backing out. However, his bodyguard reminds him of the mission's importance and the need to prevent further victims. Jimmy, after careful consideration, resolved to press on with his mission during the appeal hearing. The judge raised various points, particularly Larry's mental disorders and his assertion that he had confessed under detective pressure. Consequently, the judge granted Larry's appeal, meaning Jimmy had a mere month to gather crucial information regarding the burial sites of Larry's victims as evidence. Failing this, Larry would regain his freedom in Springfield prison. Within Springfield, Larry now worked as a janitor. Upon entering his new prison, Jimmy underwent a series of initial examinations and was eventually assigned to his cell. The prison officer advised Jimmy to give his all in his first week, emphasizing its challenges, and to maintain cleanliness. Notably, Larry had a knack for repairing machines. On his debut day in prison, Jimmy couldn't find a way to approach Larry. Frustration loomed. Jimmy decided to meet the prison psychiatrist, Dr. Zuckerman, who was already aware of the mission. A week behind bars had left Jimmy feeling anxious and uncertain about completing his mission within the prison walls. Drug trafficking persisted, as did conflicts between inmates and gang factions, with casualties going unnoticed. Most prisoners had underlying mental issues, as evidenced by the bloodstains from a previous occupant's suicide in Jimmy's cell. Dr. Zuckerman discreetly offered Jimmy his home phone number for assistance. Meanwhile, Brian learned that the person tasked with approaching their suspect was Jimmy Keene, a polished drug dealer. This choice bewildered Brian, as he wondered why police intelligence wasn't employed instead. Larry, however, wasn't as dim as he seemed, and Lauren was confident that sending the police would jeopardize the mission. Lauren had investigated numerous unsolved cases in different cities and had yet to find any leads connected to Larry. Brian's outlook was bleak, considering the dramatic shift in Larry's demeanor upon arriving in Illinois, transforming from a shy, remorseful man to a cheerful and self-assured individual. At lunchtime, Jimmy attempted to initiate contact with Larry at his table, introducing himself. Larry remained cold and indifferent, seemingly oblivious to Jimmy's presence. If he failed to recollect his mission, Jimmy would resort to immediate action, throwing a punch in that very moment, accompanied by an officer. During their encounter, Jimmy's father came to visit, despite it not being a designated visiting day. As an ex-cop, he revealed his badge, surprising Jimmy and disappointing him, as he had previously informed the officers that he had no family. Now, their awareness of his father's police affiliation was a result of his father's frail and senile condition. In an attempt to spare his father from sadness and ongoing guilt, Jimmy reminded him of the sacrifices he had made as a dedicated father who risked his life during his active duty in the police force, driven by his love for Jimmy. Following the visit, Jimmy discreetly asked Officer Carter to keep this knowledge a secret from the other inmates. Meanwhile, Lauren and Brian were scrutinizing cases they suspected were connected to Larry. Years earlier, a woman named Raina was discovered strangled to death, with a stash of contraceptive pills found in Larry's van. Additionally, a hunting knife, ropes, a mask, and gloves were uncovered, alongside a missing persons poster for Trisha Reidler. Due to insufficient evidence, Larry received a lenient punishment and was released. Brian found it perplexing that Larry initially confessed to being a serial killer but later recanted. Their detective and FBI skills were truly put to the test, prompting them to question whether Larry was indeed a serial killer or if there were other suspects capitalizing on Larry's personality. Back within the prison, Jimmy, of Italian and Irish descent, encountered Vincent Gigante, a prominent figure in the senior Italian mafia. Despite having a shoulder injury, Gigante extended an offer to work with him, a coveted opportunity among many prisoners. Jimmy was instructed to keep Gigante's injury under wraps from other inmates, as failing to do so would have dire consequences. The old man appreciated Jimmy's politeness and composure. Following Larry to the TV room, Jimmy found himself in a situation where an arrogant prisoner changed the channel, irritating Larry and the other older inmates. Jimmy took matters into his own hands, switching the channel back. The offending prisoner took offense, and a confrontation ensued, leading to Jimmy's isolation in solitary confinement. After a night in his dim cell, Larry approached Jimmy. Carter, having been informed by Jimmy's father about his mission in the prison without specific details, now knew that Jimmy was an informant, as advised by Lauren. Carter remained indifferent to Jimmy's background, whether he was a gun dealer from Wisconsin or the son of a drug dealer from Chicago. What concerned him was the potential disaster if other inmates discovered that Jimmy was a cop's son. Carter knew that if Jimmy had any wealth, he could exploit it by demanding $10,000 to maintain silence. Luckily, Larry remained unaware of the conversation between Jimmy and Carter, and he returned to his cell, safe from immediate threats. The next day, Larry awoke to a photograph of Jimmy and his brother wearing Civil War-era military uniforms for a reenactment event. Jimmy met his father to deliver the remaining money, only to discover that his father had used it for essential expenses. Furthermore, the last 2 kilos of his cocaine had been pilfered by Danny, who had betrayed him once again. Jimmy's last hope was the single remaining kilo of cocaine concealed in his speaker. Failure to obtain the money would put his life in jeopardy. Meanwhile, Brian and Lauren paid a visit to the sheriff responsible for Raina's murder case. Larry had been arrested due to his confession and the presence of contraceptive medication found in his van, which matched the evidence in the case. To the officers' astonishment, Larry had an alibi for the time of the murder. He had been participating in a Civil War reenactment event in Ohio, 700 kilometers away from the crime scene, with witnesses and substantial evidence corroborating his presence there. It raised the question of how Larry could be in 2 different places at the same time. In essence, Larry appeared to be a deranged individual fabricating false evidence to mislead the police. Jimmy and Larry were growing closer, with Jimmy using his charm to get closer to Larry. They exchanged life stories, but it was still too early for Jimmy to obtain information about the locations of Larry's victims. Carter returned to collect his money, and Jimmy hoped his father would arrive the next day with a kilo of cocaine to sell to the prison mafia. Brian remained determined not to give up on the case, while Lauren began to doubt Larry's status as a serial killer, suspecting he might simply be a madman skilled at weaving lies. Jimmy ventured with Larry to his office, where he was responsible for maintaining and repairing water heaters. Attempting to delve into Larry's life beyond his cleaning duties, Jimmy almost overheard Larry confessing about his relationships with women. Unfortunately, a prison officer entered the room, interrupting the conversation. During another visit, Jimmy's father brought unwelcome news. He couldn't locate the drugs in any of Jimmy's speakers, and suspicion fell on Danny, who had visited with full makeup without Jimmy's permission. In the midst of the investigation, Lauren adopted a disguise, posing as Jimmy's girlfriend. Up to this point, Jimmy had not yet heard Larry's confession about the murders, while Lauren had started to harbor doubts. The pressing issue was that Jimmy needed $10,000 to appease Carter, who was threatening to expose his secret. Since Lauren couldn't provide the funds, their solution was for Jimmy to stay in a protective cell until he could be transferred back to his previous prison. However, Jimmy couldn't simply let Larry go, as he strongly believed that Larry was the serial killer he sought to expose. He was determined to do whatever it took to complete his mission. In a flashback, we witnessed Jimmy's childhood, where he played football with his father after his father had finished work. Jimmy surreptitiously entered Larry's cell in search of clues to his crimes, scouring Larry's magazines. Inside, he discovered numerous articles related to sexual crimes against women and gruesome methods of murder. Upon returning to his cell, he found Carter waiting for him. And he found Carter's calm demeanor rather suspicious, considering he hadn't received the money he desired. It left Jimmy wondering if Carter was planning something for the future, as if he had a sixth sense. Larry, on the other hand, sensed that something significant was on the horizon due to the eerie silence within the prison. He was also aware that someone had intruded into his cell, although this didn't concern him since none of his possessions were missing. During a conversation with Jimmy, Larry acknowledged that Jimmy found him unpredictable. Then, a massive riot erupted within the prison, with hundreds of inmates going on a rampage and the officers becoming victims. Fortunately, both Larry and Jimmy managed to avoid involvement or becoming victims of the riot. However, the aftermath of the riot left debris and bloodstains everywhere. As the head of the cleaning team, Larry, along with his team members including Jimmy, were assigned by the warden to clean up the aftermath. While cleaning, Larry opened up to Jimmy about his childhood, revealing that he had grown up near a cemetery and was forced by his father to dig graves at night. In contrast, Jimmy had enjoyed a happy childhood as the son of a police officer. Surprisingly, though, Jimmy had no childhood friends and spent most of his days at home, waiting for his father to return. As a poignant revelation, Larry disclosed that his father had taught him to steal jewelry from corpses just buried. As a young boy, Larry had been terrified when removing a ring from a corpse's finger became challenging. He had been taught not to hesitate in cutting the finger if needed. Jimmy, in contrast, shared that his father was a firefighter and his mother worked at a bar, leaving little time for family. It was during this conversation that their dispute began. Jimmy revealed that his mother was a flirtatious woman who craved admiration from multiple men, akin to a psychic. Larry, however, could sense that not all of this was entirely accurate. Jimmy went on to recount his parents' divorce, which occurred 6 months later. His mother brought an abusive man named Glenn into their lives, and Glenn frequently subjected Jimmy, his brother, and his mother to physical abuse. Jimmy couldn't comprehend why his mother remained with Glenn. He later discovered that she wanted Jimmy to grow up strong and seek vengeance on her behalf. In pursuit of this goal, he began taking taekwondo, karate, and jiu-jitsu classes. At the age of 14, he believed he was ready to confront Glenn, but ended up badly beaten. In a moment of vulnerability, Jimmy confessed to Larry that he had contemplated killing his mother by pushing her down the stairs. Larry, in turn, disclosed a method of rendering someone unconscious by soaking a cloth in starter fluid, keeping it in a mason jar in his car. When used, this method would render someone unconscious within seconds. Jimmy probed further, and Larry admitted to using this method on girls to prevent them from harming him. However, this was not sufficient evidence, unlike Larry's case as a notorious womanizer. Jimmy vowed to seduce any woman he encountered, and their encounters would end with a kiss. Towards the end of the 4th episode, Gary visited Larry, and they discussed a woman they had picked up in California who later departed on a bright green Harley. It raised questions about whether she might be Larry's next victim, but this remained undisclosed. Gary also informed Larry that the police had arrived at their home, seeking further evidence related to the Court of Appeals, where Larry had embarrassed them. Episode 5 commenced with Jimmy's desire to meet with the prison psychiatrist. However, he was surprised to discover that it wasn't Dr. Zuckerman waiting for him. The new psychiatrist had no knowledge of Jimmy's mission and intended to explore his mental state further. This puzzled Jimmy, who believed his mental state was fine. The doctor had been called by Larry, who had referred to Jimmy as his best friend. She asked Jimmy to empathize with Larry and not be a threat to him. Jimmy feigned ignorance, which left the doctor upset, leading her to leave. In the meantime, Brian and Lauren continued their investigation, this time delving into the murder of Tricia Reitler. Traveling to Marion in search of clues regarding the victim's burial location, all they could see were vast fields at a remote gas station. Back in prison, Larry opened up to Jimmy about Gary, expressing the belief that his brother was no longer interested in Civil War reenactments. Gary had recently married, and his new wife disapproved of the activity after Larry had previously divulged the truth about his actions. Jimmy attempted to gather more information from Larry, inquiring about the ages of the girls he had been involved with. However, Larry responded with an unsettling question, seeming peculiar when Jimmy mentioned a 14-year-old girl. Unfortunately, an officer arrived to escort Larry to address an engine leak. Meanwhile, Brian and Lauren finally reached the gas station, where an employee informed them that it had been present for several years. Lauren sought the manager's phone number, while Brian discovered information about a nearby auto parts shop owned by a mechanic named John Dickey. The employee further mentioned that the gas station had opened in the spring of '94, with excavation work commencing around the middle of the summer of '93. Their search proved fruitless, as the psychopath had effectively covered his tracks. The senior mafia leader learned of Jimmy's previous attempt to smuggle drugs into the prison. It turned out that Carter sought his help to pay off his debt, as his attempt to blackmail Jimmy had failed. He apologized for his previous harassment. In prison, Larry had a session with a prison psychiatrist. He was more interested in posing questions than being asked them, exuding confidence and pride after the judge approved his appeal. Sometimes individuals with mental disorders outsmart their doctors. The doctor acknowledged Jimmy's charisma, but found him arrogant. Larry believed his friend had endured significant hardship, but had not allowed it to break him. Upon reaching an auto parts store, Brian and Lauren met John Dickey, who described Larry as creepy and strange. He had occasionally kicked Larry out for making girls uncomfortable with his behavior. Notably, Dickey's daughter, Audrey, had been one of those girls. Jimmy's attempts to contact Dr. Zuckerman proved futile, as his account remained unknown. An impatient gangster in the prison yard waited for his turn, and the situation almost escalated to violence. Carter began terrorizing Jimmy by leaking his identity as an informant to other inmates, including the head of the Italian mafia, putting Jimmy's life at risk. Big Jim grew anxious because he couldn't reach Jimmy and feared something had happened to him. Besides his duties in the heating engine room, Larry had been spending time in the workshop, where he had been busy carving wooden crows. After finishing the carvings, Larry planned to send them to his house. But when Jimmy asked what they were for, Larry quickly changed the subject. He'd inquired about why Jimmy had gotten into trouble in the phone booth. Seizing the opportunity to trick Larry, Jimmy admitted to having an issue with an officer who was somehow linked to Larry. The officer had branded Larry as a predator and murderer of young girls. Larry chuckled at the accusation, confessing that he had never raped anyone in his life, only engaging with adult women. However, the story was cut short as Larry shifted the conversation to ask Jimmy how many women he had slept with. Jimmy confessed to having been with around 80 women, his charisma working in his favor. In contrast, Larry always felt insecure, believing women wouldn't look at him twice, let alone engage in conversation. Larry did admit to having been involved with a woman named Jessica Roach, whom Brian had found in the field with a flat bicycle tire. Larry offered her a ride in his van, but when Jessica tried to escape, he mentioned her reaction, prompting Jimmy to question why she had done so. Larry gave Jimmy a suspicious look and explained that Jessica had questioned the beard on his face when he attempted to kiss her. This had led to Jessica slapping and beating him. In response, Larry had smothered her face with starter fluid and transported her to an isolated location. Jessica fought back fiercely, scratching Larry's hands until the skin peeled off. Larry exhibited intelligence in eliminating evidence by cleaning the flesh stuck between Jessica's fingernails to avoid potential DNA discovery. He smothered and beat Jessica until he felt as if he were in a dream, and he remembered that they were both naked. Hearing this gruesome story, Jimmy had to conceal his perturbation while maintaining a facade of interest. Larry's malevolent actions didn't end there. He dragged Jessica to the middle of a field, utilizing 2 leather belts around her neck like a tourniquet, making her neck crack as he tightened them, eventually taking her last breath. Brian and Lauren interviewed Audrey about her encounters with Larry. The creepy man had repeatedly tried to persuade her, and even asked her to enter his van. He had given her 2 earrings, a pendant and ballet shoes, which were no longer in her possession after being sold at a lost items auction. Astonishingly, one item remained in the warehouse: Jessica's bicycle. Brian presented the evidence to Prosecutor Beaumont, but it was insufficient to apprehend the perpetrator, as the serial number on the bicycle had been erased with acid, rendering it impossible to retrieve fingerprints belonging to Larry or Jessica. With 4 years having passed since the incident, Jimmy became their sole hope for uncovering the truth. On that night, Jimmy's father watched the prison from the outside, his eyes filled with sadness as he thought about his son in his cell. In his cell, Jimmy ignored Larry when the latter called out to him. He was attempting to control himself after hearing Larry's chilling confession. Later that night, Jimmy had a nightmare. When he woke up, he was surprised to find that Larry was not in his cell. Larry explained that what he had said the previous day was untrue, which left Jimmy feeling disappointed and deceived. Jimmy questioned why Larry had murdered Jessica, but hadn't buried her, especially since he had worked as a gravedigger. Larry explained that it had been dark at the time, and he had seen a man near his van, who was a mechanic and a witness at the crime scene. When Jimmy accused Larry of lying, Larry became angry and insisted that the story was true, even though Jimmy remained skeptical. Larry took Jimmy to the wood shop to reveal his true self. That morning, Jimmy's father suffered a stroke and was rushed to the hospital. In the wood shop, Larry was working on a map with dozens of scattered dots, which caught Jimmy's attention. There were 21 points on the map, correlating with the 21 carved crows, symbolizing death. Larry explained that the map and crows would be sent to Gary's home, and they watched over the dead. At this point, Larry admitted to the murder of Tricia Reidler, explaining that he had stabbed her multiple times when she attacked him, followed by strangling her. He had lost consciousness while raping the lifeless girl but woke up naked. Larry further confessed to burying other women without anyone knowing. With time running out, Jimmy tried to persuade Larry to give peace to the victims and their families by revealing the locations of their graves. However, Larry refused, determined to get out of prison. In a fit of impatience, Jimmy threatened to ensure that Larry would lose his appeal and remain in prison for the rest of his life. In response, Larry suddenly realized that Beaumont had sent Jimmy there, and an unexpected confrontation unfolded, with dramatic consequences. Back in his cell, Jimmy attempted to contact Dr. Zuckerman, but the officers refused to assist him. In the morning, the female psychiatrist unexpectedly dragged Jimmy to solitary confinement. It seemed Larry had been spreading lies about him, and even the officer refused to provide him with a pen. Meanwhile, Big Jim remained in the hospital, connected to a ventilator, with the map as his sole concern. When food arrived, Jimmy once again requested a pen, but his pleas were ignored. Refusing to give up, he used his blood to draw the map on the cell wall. Although not perfect, Jimmy managed to create the map, but he was extremely weak due to the blood loss. Meanwhile, Brian and Lauren traveled to Larry's parents' house to continue their investigation. It appeared that Larry's father was burning something, and since they didn't have a warrant, Gary only allowed them to talk outside the house. They tried to persuade Gary to reveal the truth about his brother's true nature. He agreed that his brother was not normal, but that didn't mean he was a murderer. As Gary returned inside, Brian and Lauren became concerned and took out their guns, fearing a confrontation. However, Gary returned with a few photos and tearfully told the officers about Jimmy's mission assigned by the FBI. 10 years ago, Gary and his sister had given a ride to a drunk girl who wanted to take Larry's virginity. While they were all intoxicated in a tent, Larry raped the girl. Larry's behavior at the time had been deeply disturbing, akin to that of a wild wolf. Gary could only watch in silence, deeply shocked by what he had witnessed. Although the girl left the next day seemingly unharmed, Gary couldn't deny that there was something evil within his younger brother. He revealed that sometimes when the girl said no, she meant it, and Larry's demeanor had been like that of a wolf. In the end, they questioned Gary about his own actions during the incident. Finally, Jimmy found some relief when Dr. Zuckerman came to release him from solitary confinement. Lauren, as she arrived at the prison, immediately handed Jimmy a pen so he could redraw the map. However, traumatized and knowing the locations of the graves, Jimmy struggled to redraw it accurately. Lauren smiled when Jimmy mentioned that he had heard the details of Larry's confession regarding the murders of Jessica and Tricia. She believed that this was enough for his testimony at the appeal court. But it seemed that the authorities were either downplaying the significance of the information or intentionally covering up for Larry's crimes. Larry's father decided to burn the map and the carved birds, believing he had succeeded in protecting his son's dark secrets. Attorney Beaumont and his team managed to convince the judge to release Jimmy from the courtroom. In their first meeting, Jimmy spoke with Brian. Although the graves were still undiscovered, Jimmy had ensured that the serial killer would not bury another woman. In the hearing, the judges decided to deny Larry's appeal, which meant that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. As this story is based on a true event, it is known that Larry attempted suicide in prison but failed. Big Jim was overjoyed that his son was returning home. Gary, meanwhile, visited his brother in prison, believing it was the best place for him. He urged Larry to tell the truth, but Larry remained silent, convinced that he had been corrupted. During a plane journey, Jimmy's attention was caught by a beautiful flight attendant. While gazing out of the window, he saw a field that resembled the map Larry had drawn. To this day, none of the grave sites have been found, and Larry spent the remainder of his life in prison. And with that, the series came to an end. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notification for more movie recaps.